The mental health challenge, it's a truly global challenge. It really does require innovation. What is needed in different places? How can this really be driven by communities?
We have pushed a lot of innovations. The question that we asked ourselves, is there an appetite from the government to take those innovations? What could we do to augment the demand from the governments to adopt those innovations? Not only pushing innovation, not only supporting innovators, we have been also doing an ecosystem work to enable the systems to take those innovations.
Target in the 2018 Lancet Commission was that 5% of health budgets in countries would be directed towards mental health. We are nowhere near that target. We're still sitting at a global average of 2%. So saying this will end up like public sector integration, government will take this up. Even the most successful innovations with great evidence, with great partnerships, with the right kind of buy-in, will struggle to scale.
Welcome to Mind the Gap, a podcast about what's missing in global mental health.
I'm Christy Savetta.
I'm Chris Underhill.
And we're here to explore the stories, solutions, and systems shaping mental health around the world.
From community champions to global change makers.
Let's dive into what's working and what's not.
And what it'll take to close the gap.
Welcome back to Mind the Gap, the podcast where we explore the funding and skills gap in mental health and spotlight those who are working to close them. We are really thrilled today to be joined by two incredible leaders from Grand Challenges Canada.
Absolutely. Today we're joined by Nicole Bardikoff, the Associate Director for Global Mental Health at Grand Challenges Canada, where she leads investments and partnerships to support youth mental health in low-resource settings, most notably and more recently through the Being Initiative.
And joining her is Sahil Chopra, Portfolio Manager for the same team, bringing over a decade of experience in public health, from grant making to policy to implementation, research, actually, if I'm not mistaken as well. Nicole and Sahil, we're delighted you could join us. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us. We're really thrilled to be here.
Well, thank you so much. Even I'm very excited. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. Thank you.
Great. You are indeed welcome. Let's dive right in and start with legacy. Now, in some cases, the talk about legacy is odd because funders haven't been funding for very long. But in the case of GCC, you've been funding mental health since 2012. So that is legacy, something incredibly unique in this sector. What has the journey looked like for you so far?
Yeah, it's a good point. And we realize we are a little bit unique in that way. So GCC has been around now for 15 years. And one of our earliest programs was global mental health. It's kind of baked into our DNA as an organization, this focus on mental health. And because, as you said, a lot of funders haven't been in this space for a very long time, and it's really exciting to see more funders move into it. But in 2012, when our first funding went out, we kind of quickly became one of the larger mental health innovation funders. And I should say, not because we had massive investments in the space, but because it was such an under-resourced area. There were so few funders that our work there became one of the larger portfolios. And it's been really interesting, that learning journey. And I think part of the piece about it that's, in my mind at least, unique is that the mental health challenge, it's a truly global challenge. There's no, I would say, I don't think there's one country that's figured out how to appropriately deliver mental health services and care across a whole population. This is something where it's not a problem in just one part of the world. It's really a problem everywhere. And because of that, and I think it's why GCC has focused on this so much, it really does require innovation. What is needed in different places? How can this really be driven by communities? Mental health is so unique and culturally different in points of how mental health is spoken about, how mental health is experienced. So it's been a really interesting journey for us to kind of see all of these different models, see a lot of this different learning. GCC's approach is really about innovations and projects being led by local communities. Those are the people who are most likely to come up with relevant, appropriate, sustainable solutions. And so that has been really interesting to see. And it's been really interesting to see other funders also, join in this space and bring their own experiences in other health areas to bear as well. And I think this, like, where this has really led us to, and you mentioned at the beginning, the kind of evolution of this is the Being Initiative, where which is focused on youth mental health prevention and promotion, where not only are we saying, yes, those teams on the ground are the ones who should come up with the solutions and they're who we want to fund. But in that case, we also said, those are the teams that should come up with the funding priorities. So it's not coming from us what needs to be funded in, Colombia or India or Ghana. It's really, we spent about a year with local teams doing a massive amount of landscape analysis and research and stakeholder consultations and consensus building to say, okay, these are the unique challenges in these different countries. And now we'll say, okay, great, here's funding behind it. Let's try and support tackling some of these. So I see that as kind of the end, not the end, where we currently are, I should say, for GCC of just kind of standing on the legacy that has come before for these past 13 years.
Hmm.
Mhm. That's incredible. And actually, I think that research, correct me if I'm wrong, can all be found actually on the Being Initiative website, right? There's a massive document with all of your findings.
Yes, there is, because we also looked at it and said, there's no way this is something we can tackle alone. And there's no way this is information that we want to just hold. So we've made all of it public. We've said, here's all of this work that's been done. Here's what we're doing. Here's all these other areas where we hope others can potentially step in and also fund some of this work.
Awesome. We will be sure to pop a link on that as well in our, the link of our Spotify and our YouTube channels here. So if folks want to read it and check it out. It's an awesome document. I really do recommend taking the time for it. Nicole, one of the things you mentioned was, that the challenge in mental health really does require innovation, right? It's a really big element, especially in kind of global mental health. Innovation is a huge word. It can be defined in so many different ways. And I'm curious, within the context of Grand Challenges Canada, what does innovation in mental health mean, and how is that evolving right now?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a great question. And it's one that I think, Sahil, is so close to this work. So I'll turn to you to speak to some of that.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Christy, for asking this question. And I would start by saying that what innovation means for Grand Challenges Canada. So in 2010, when Grand Challenges Canada was launched, Peter Singer, who co-founded Grand Challenges Canada, so he came up with a very brilliant idea about integrated innovation. Now, he also suggested, he published a paper, kind of an article, and we could share that link too. He said in the beginning that innovation in itself, a word, is kind of a paradox, because we have been using innovation in so many different ways. So it is very difficult to define innovation in one single terminology. So this concept of integrated innovation is about a scientific innovation. How do we ensure that scientific innovations which have been produced by innovators could scale it up? So when we mean by scientific innovation, we could think of a product. So when we develop any solution to any complex public health challenge, we think of a product, and whether we want to develop a new product or we want to define this product. So this is called, in a very simple language, called a scientific innovation. But how do you utilize this knowledge? How do you utilize this product to reach out to the communities that you want to serve? This is called a social innovation, and this could take form in many ways. This could take form in the form of health systems innovation, the social determinants of health, those kind of things that come within the social innovation. And then there is a third term, which is a business innovation, which means that how do we reach out to those communities with that product in a cost-effective manner? So this is called a business innovation. So he produced that idea that that if we have an integrated approach of innovation, there's a best way to define a solution to a complex public health challenge rather than having a singular benefits of each of these separate innovations. And happy to share more examples around that, Christy, if you want.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
No, just to say thank you. That's really interesting. And I was just wondering, before we move on to the next part of the session, whether you could speak a little bit about de-risking early stage innovation. That would be very helpful, I think.
So we have a very unique graduated funding framework. So we fund innovators at a seed level wherein they test the prototypes. And then once this prototype is tested, then we fund those innovators at different stages of innovation. This is called our graduated funding framework. So we give an opportunity to our innovators to redefine or refine the innovation at an appropriate stages. And we help them building those partnerships, which are very important to scale. And we help them producing that evidence, which is very important, that could be used by other funders who may not be that risk prone, who are, because some of the scientific innovation that we fund, they are generally more risk averse. So most funders are risk averse. So that is the reason I think GCC plays such an important role, because we fund innovations at an early stages wherein we could generally take risk, because we have certain high risk appetite towards certain seed innovations. And it is true also because 90% of our innovations actually fail at the seed stage. And some of the innovations which go up to the transition to scale phase, wherein we develop those partnerships and we help them to reach to a point wherein we could certainly say that it is now ready for scale.
Thank you for digging into that. I'd love to hear, I think we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what comes after some of those early interventions and innovations in just a minute. I wanted as well to come back briefly. I think when you were talking about the integrated innovation model, I'd be curious if you could share like an example or a handful of examples of something that might fit within, the kind of three-part innovation that you're looking at here in terms of that integrated approach.
And many of us are not aware that Romania is a country wherein they have the highest prevalence of bullying and cyberbullying among young people across Europe. So when we were thinking about solving that issue, we were sourcing innovations, and we came across an innovation that is actually combine these three different parts. So this is called Rethink. So Rethink is kind of a game that they had the Babeș-Bolyai University in Romania. So they have trialed this game to test whether this game could impact youth mental health and well-being in different ways. What we liked about this innovation was because many of the anti-bullying interventions that we have come across in developed countries or even in developing countries, we have seen that they are only focused on awareness generation or the knowledge generation. They haven't focused on one critical element, which was missing, is about how do we inculcate skills amongst young people, especially about emotional resilience to tackle those kind of challenges when they come across in the schools about bullying and cyberbullying. So this Rethink model, so they've already had this kind of a game, Rethink game, which is a scientific part of that innovation, which is a technical part of that innovation. So they would like to use this product to test whether they could, whether by utilizing this product, this game could reduce incidences of bullying and cyberbullying in schools. So this is a scientific innovation that they would like to test. So they have been modifying the product. The second is about social innovation. So with the social innovation, they have been training teachers so that they could support young people while playing this game. And they've been also supporting parents because parents play an important role in that. How do we engage parents in such a manner that they could support once the students go home? And then the third important part is the business innovation. The Babeș-Bolyai University is actually a great example of that because they've produced massive amount of innovation through their spin-offs. So we have been funding the spin-off of Babeș-Bolyai University called Psychological Solutions and Technologies. So they produce they are for-profit companies. So they have been utilizing this product. How do we reach out to, say, for instance, private schools in such a manner that private schools could utilize? Either the government could buy that game, or maybe the private school or the families could buy that game in such a manner that it is cost effective. So this is the way that they have integrated all these components of the technical component, like a product, the social innovation engaging teachers, and the business innovation through the spin-off Babeș-Bolyai University.
Wow. So really what we're looking at is like an innovative tool almost that has been, really thought through, like what is that like access model and what is the embedding model that really makes the most sense in order to ensure that as many people can access it, use it, understand it as possible, and who are kind of the determinants and the social determinants of that experience, and how do we get them involved as well? And then thinking about how do we sustain it? What is that kind of cost effective lens, and does that product market fit exist? And if so, who's paying for it, and what does it look like? That's great. Thank you for that example. I think that really helps contextualize that integrated innovation. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks a lot, Christy. And I hadn't realized, that particular country had those particular concerns. So that's very helpful right there. It's very interesting. I was going to ask you both, in fact, so maybe Nicole, you could jump in first. What do you think the biggest challenges are right now in funding and scaling mental health innovations? Because we've talked quite a lot, and we've had this wonderful example, which is great. We've talked about the mission of being, for example. And so I was wondering where you were coming across the biggest challenges in funding and scaling mental health innovation. Nicole.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's not one with an easy answer. And I think some of it's been touched on, which is like, how do you really support innovations to scale in this space without a lot of funding? In some countries, like weak infrastructure or systems to be able to take it up, right? Like there's not an easy, obvious pathway in some cases, or where there might be an obvious pathway, there isn't money to do it. So what GCC and Sahil touched on it, our transition to scale framework is really about trying to get innovations through that valley of death to where they're kind of ready and poised to be scaling. We see that there's money for early stage testing, and then in some cases there's some money for scaling. The in-between can get hard because really what we're at points supporting innovators to do is just kind of test and pivot a scaling approach. So I think that's a key piece that we see is really being comfortable with, we might need to go back to the drawing board and look at this again. So being willing to shift. But I think one of the really big challenges is, who is that, Chrissy, you mentioned it, who is that payer at scale? What is that going to look like in mental health? There's not going to be a lot of commercial models where it's a fee for service and your end user is the payer, especially not if you're trying to serve underserved communities. So what does that look like? What does it look like in contexts where there's not a lot of philanthropy, where there's not a lot of those private opportunities, and where, as much as we hope this would be different, there isn't the same kind of budget and funding available through governments. I think that the last target in like the 2018 Lancet Commission was that 5% of health budgets in countries would be directed towards mental health. We are nowhere near that target. We're still sitting at a global average of 2%. And in a lot of low and middle income countries, it's closer to 1%. So saying this will end up like public sector integration, government will take this up, even with the right kind of buy-in, that just might not be possible. There isn't a line item. So I see that as really the biggest challenge. Like even the most successful innovations with great evidence, with great partnerships, with the right kind of buy-in will struggle to scale because there isn't an obvious next space for that to go. There isn't the obvious pot of money. There isn't the obvious just, okay, well, we're going to integrate into this system and we go from there. So I really see that as the biggest challenge. It sounds quite negative as I position it that way. But there are a lot of organizations doing this and thinking about this in really thoughtful ways. I think a key thing is being willing to pivot and think about, what are the different opportunities, and really like what's the end game thinking for the innovation? Like, what do you want this to look like? What do you want your role in this to be? And how do you then try and position the innovation correctly to deal with all of those challenges at the end? And maybe I can hear Sahil, maybe it's a good pass over to you to talk about like, what would we look for? Like, what are the kind of things that we would, hope to see? Because those are the pieces where we see that this tends to lead to kind of like more successful scaling, even within this context of like weak systems and a lack of resources.
Yes, sure. So many of our applications that we had received so far, and we are very grateful that we got like so many applications, about 3/4 application, they haven't understood the problem really well. When we say the problem, it means like, for instance, in India and in Romania, for instance, like just I talked about this bullying and cyberbullying, many of the innovators, they haven't come to a conclusion that the basic lack of life skills among certain people is kind of an issue that could resolve that problem. So I think one, of course, like many of the innovation that have passed to our next stages, they had really done really well in terms of researching what the problem is. And the second solution is like, how do you align your solution and how do you align your solution with the current priorities, and whether this organization or an innovator had a vision for this particular innovation. Like Nicole said, I think Nicole touched on a very important piece. What is the end game for that innovation? We all understand that things may not go well, things may not go well like we plan, but do we have a plan for the next 5 years for this innovation? And if we have a plan, do we know the kind of steps that we need to take this innovation to scale? And we are ready to help innovators to redefine those steps again and again. But then the point is, does the leadership in that organization have that mindset of looking at innovation from that perspective? So I would say like these are the two important things. One is, of course, like I said, the leadership plays an important role. Second is about defining the problem. Those are like two important things. There's a quote from Einstein, I'm sure, just because it is so relevant right now in this context, is if I have 1 hour to solve a problem, then 95% of the time I would think of the problem, why is the problem, and the 5% I would spend on the solution. So this is what I would say to all our innovators, like look at the problem first and then think of a solution.
Awesome. And I love that. I love that framing, a great call out, focusing on the problem. 'Cause really within that is where you'll find, an opportunity for an innovation, for a solution. I want to push a little bit more on this actually. So I'm curious, you've talked a lot about what you're looking for is very much like the problem part, researching and then aligning the solution to that. But still, given the system or the funding landscape that we're in, organizations might still struggle to scale innovations, especially if we paint the picture of an environment where if a government's a payer at scale, for instance, what does that actually look like? And I know there are plenty of options, of course, to look at from a scale perspective, but also with the context of, the funding landscape, I suppose, over this past year with the U.S. the U.S. government shutdown, governments are a really big part of what comes next. So I'm curious, how are you thinking about systems change? And how does that shape your current strategy and what you look for? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think this is such an important question. And I think not an important question, I think such an important point right now, given the scenario. So I think, and first I just talk about Grand Challenges Canada as such. So we have funded about 1,700 innovations so far. And we understood up to this point, and we have a new strategy in place that would go till 2030. We've understood that we have pushed a lot of innovations in the market. But so the question that we asked ourselves, is there an appetite from the government to take those innovations? So what could we do to create a demand or to augment a demand from the governments to adopt those innovations? So this is the kind of the important question that we have been asking ourselves too. So that is why we actually, in our Being initiative, we had done, which we haven't done before, and we're very excited about this, is not only pushing innovation, not only supporting innovators, we have been also doing an ecosystem work to enable the systems to take those innovations. And there is a 100% scenario that we won't, like the government may not take all the innovations. Our idea is not to consider that all the innovation would be scaled. Our idea is to test different, maybe 7-10 approaches, and maybe 1 or 2 approaches could be scaled, which could be taken up by the government. Now, what do we mean by this ecosystem thing? And maybe I could give you an example. For instance, like in India, I'm sorry, maybe at the end of this, we only know about India and India. So India is one country wherein when we did the landscaping analysis, we understood like family functioning play a key important role in defining youth mental health. But when we looked at the policy frameworks, when we look at the guidelines, there's no mention of families in those guidelines and the policy frameworks. So if we keep funding innovations and we do not engage with the government to have conducive or the supportive policy frameworks, then you end up in a situation wherein you won't be able to scale because there's no government buy-in for those innovations. So with this ecosystem work, we have been doing 2 things especially. And one is, of course, like looking at those policy frameworks and seeing, if there is a possibility of doing some collaborations with the government and looking at different multi-stakeholders and seeing like if there is an opportunity to make sure that government is engaged and government understood the problem well, and then they are able to engage with those innovators to take up those innovations. The second important thing, I think, which could be true in many ways for some countries right now, and for some countries in future, is augmenting domestic funding. We know that there are philanthropists, there are philanthropic organizations, there are local philanthropic organizations. So our role with that ecosystem is to engage with those local philanthropic organizations so that they could also understand that this kind of innovations exist. We have already tested those innovations. They are ready to scale. Would you be able to take up those innovations which are aligned with our strategies? So one of our tasks is to bring the domestic funders, to bring that both the governments and the domestic funders together so that we could have a coherent plan for those innovations to scale in future.
Thanks so much, Sahil, for taking that question and for developing it further. I suppose I wanted to come to a point which is a segue from where you are, which is what happens to locally led organizations? As you may know from my own background, I have, run organizations which deliver mental health services into countries or parts of countries, and of course where we have trained locally led organizations and so on. I have a lot of interest in that level of delivery, which of course is the sort of bread and butter of mental health delivery in a way. So for locally led organizations, what do you think, Nicole, are the barriers to accessing global mental health funding? And how do you think we can fix this in favor of those organizations in the future?
Yeah, it's something I think we think about a lot. How do we support these organizations that, say, GCC is funding to also attract other investment to be able to, really highlight and continue to support their work? I think there's a few different challenges. I see with mental health innovations at Point, there's a challenge around explaining the impact. And not to say that the organizations themselves have challenges around explaining it, but how do we collect data that is also interesting and relevant to funders? What do we do in a space where there isn't, like, we've tried as a field to get to some type of even looking at like common measure frameworks, but like how do we collect data that is relevant to the organization and to the communities they're serving and is also relevant to other funders? And I hear this from funders a lot of like, I'm interested in maybe jumping into the mental health space, but I don't really know where to start, and I don't really know how to see how what I'm investing in is leading to impact. Like, what do I measure? What do I ask organizations to measure? And how do you make sure that that's like culturally appropriate and relevant? And how are we in this small field already so fragmented in the way that we approach this question? So I see that as a real challenge. I see that as a barrier to funders who aren't already kind of tapped into the mental health space, being able to jump in. And the easy approach sometimes is to go with larger international organizations, academic organizations, and not always those local community-based groups who may be looking at things really differently because they're looking at things the way it makes sense to their communities, as they should. So what we've tried to do at GCC, we don't dictate. Like, we'll say, how do we want to measure what we call lives improved? Tell us how you think lives improved should be measured for what you're doing. Let you know if that resonates with us. What measurement tool do you want to use? Well, also thinking of the framework is, what measurement tool do you want to use? And can we give you a bit of insight of what we think will be helpful to other funders as well? Like, trying to set you up for success. It's very topical question. I've had 2 calls already today that are talking about exactly this issue, this measurement issue. And I will also say that a group of funders are trying to come together to say, how can we figure out how to support more funding to these types of organizations? And measurement keeps coming up. So I think that and I know a lot of the implementing organizations are looking at this as well. So we're trying to sort this out. And I see this as a key issue. And it's both at like clinical individual outcome measures and then, functional outcomes. How do you then take that to finance ministers and say, this leads to, economic productivity, GDP, all of these different changes? We're just not great at telling that story. I think the field's very aware of that. So I'm hoping there'll be some change that will come through it, but we'll see.
I think you're right. I think the field is incredibly aware of that. I think locally led organizations are as well, right? Funders are as well. I mean, it's a massive challenge. And what's so interesting about it as well is, we contextualize the problem of mental health oftentimes in data that we have that isn't necessarily capturing the full picture, because we don't necessarily have the data to capture the full picture. So you might have, data from one country or one area, for instance, that says we have, X incidents of depression or anxiety, but that data is missed or off or wrong. So we don't actually have the data on that level either to really be able to measure the problems. So it kind of goes back as well to this issue of 95% of it should be the problem. So how do we really fix that data issue to understand the problem at its core? I'm curious, obviously this is a live discussion in a sense that it is ever ongoing, but do you have any examples of like measurement tools that you think would hit this mix between like lives improved, that's like useful and supportive for locally led organizations and be helpful to funders as well and governments to understand like what's happening and how is it working? It's a big question.
It's a big question. It's a good question. And it's one I don't have an easy answer to. I think there's been some push offering from, they say, the funder community around like, okay, so for some of these clinical level, so these like clinical measurements or these outcome tools like depression, anxiety, could we align on just using the same tools? Not to say they're the right tools or the best tools, but just at least try and, as a field, use some of the same things like the GAD-7, like the PHQ-9, in addition to anything else, just to at least say, we can see some commonality across. I think there's been there's value in that, and then there's also challenges for different contexts because those are not, even when culturally adapted, they're still not developed for, a broad countries in the global south. It's very much a global north framework. So we've started to ask some organizations, like, what are the important things for you in both the tool, like, what do you need? It needs to be freely accessible. It needs to be short. It needs to be visual. Like, how do we work with that? And then also, what are the domains that you're interested in? Like, what is that lives improve to you? And I think one of the things that comes up for our work, and it's not a surprise, we're talking about youth mental health prevention and promotion, connectivity, like social connectivity, coming up often as a domain that innovators are looking at and that resonate with community. Now, again, I think there's no one tool that like properly captures it, but that as an area to focus on, especially for young people, I mean, for across the lifespan, but especially for young people in that period in their lives, is coming through as something that's important to focus on. So I think it's an area we need to continue to look at and really challenge ourselves as funders of what we're asking organizations to collect, if that makes sense. And also just as like a broader field to try and say, how can we align this a little bit better and get to the point where we have like a good understanding of what mental health, mental ill health means for different communities. And we've got that really good understanding. It's easier to then get to that next level of outcome of like, and addressing this equals X for a community, a country, etc. But we need to kind of figure out that core piece, I think, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great call as well to other funders and folks in the space is, what are you doing within this space in terms of measurement and data, and how are you listening potentially to the people that you are funding or the people that you want to fund, and to the communities that they're serving. And I'd be curious, do you guys have other lessons, ideas that you might want to share with funders who potentially are outside of the mental health space that want to get into it?
Yeah, and maybe I'll speak briefly, and then Sahil, I'll give it to you for the last word on that. I think the key thing is mental health in some cases has fit everywhere and nowhere, and we've kind of erred on the side of it fitting a bit nowhere and being a little bit siloed. But we know that if you address mental health, you will hit other health outcomes faster, easier. So I'd say to other funders is like, think about mental health. You don't see your work as mental health. I would challenge you. I'd say you're funding physical health, you're funding infectious disease, you're funding education, you're funding child well-being. Like all of this is mental health. And integrating mental health into that work will help you hit these targets faster. We know funding mental health alongside HIV, TB, malaria, it leads to better health outcomes. And I'd say be open to that. Be open to that. It's a force multiplier. Like it will help into your work. You are a mental health funder, whether you think you're a mental health funder or not, but better to be upfront about that.
Maybe I could, Nicole, you said very well. Maybe I could say that maybe in future, I think I could look at funding scenarios in two ways, like mental health specific funders and mental health sensitive funders. So I would argue that whomsoever funders are not actually funding mental health, they're going to be mental health sensitive funders, because I think it is now the right stage. Maybe if you asked this question maybe 5 years ago, nobody would have said, okay, we are going to do mental health. But now I think I've seen and I've experienced a lot of funders who have been funding, for instance, like sexual and reproductive health. They have been reaching out to us and asking, how do we understand mental health better? And they have been very proactive in terms of approaching us and understanding more about, how do they integrate mental health? For instance, like whether teenage pregnancies lead to mental health outcomes or is it vice versa? So how do we break that vicious cycle? So it's just very important to break that cycle of, mental health leads to what or what leads to mental health. So this is an important area that we all need to take care of. And I'm very happy that a lot of these funders have been now asking these questions that, for instance, mental health integration into TB, infectious diseases, SRHR especially, I think. And we have been testing some innovations. Maybe in next 2 years, you would have some answers from us, like how do we do that? But how far is still not being understood well, but it is something that we need to move forward with.
So thank you very much indeed for that, Sahil, and of course Nicole as well. Sadly, we're getting to that stage where we have to wrap up. And for me, at least, the time has gone really quickly. And I very much appreciate the way in which you've tackled our questions and our thoughts, and the fascinating way in which you've come back. A couple of things that I suppose I'm taking away from this conversation. First of all, coming to one of the last points first, the whole question of the integration of mental health work so as to support both government and local authorities, as well as, of course, smaller organizations. And the whole idea of mental health being part of the warp and weft of life itself, and therefore being both important to identify, but also to respect that it is part of a larger societal matter. And therefore, being the point that you made, Nicole, if you're funding mental health, you're also funding physical disability, you're also funding all sorts of other illnesses and conditions. I think I've learned an awful lot from you, Sahil, about innovation and your passion for what you call scientific innovation has been moving, to be honest. It's actually been moving to see the way in which you've addressed this matter, and you take it very seriously. And I was going to make a joke at some point, and then I realized that it would have been quite wrong at that to have made a joke right in the middle of that discourse on scientific innovation. And so I held back, which is unusual for me. But I did hold back because I thought it was so important. The whole question of measurement and data obviously has come up. And then naturally, GCC, of course, is in the business of also funding. And so therefore, we really go back to almost the first question that we asked you, that I had the privilege of asking you, which is the whole question of being a legacy funder. And that makes, it puts you in such a responsible position in a way. And yet, what I think is marvelous is, and I remember Kari Silva also being like this, when she and I did work together. You take this very lightly and in a very good way. So you carry this responsibility on your shoulders, but in a light way, which of course makes it much easier to discourse, to question, and to think, which of course is what all of this is about. Let me pass over to Christy for her thoughts as we come to the final minutes of this session.
I think you summed it up beautifully. Thanks, Chris. And Sahil, any, it's impressive that your passion held Chris's jokes at bay. That doesn't happen that often. So that's delightful. No, you really did sum it up well. I mean, one of the really big things I think is super interesting about your approach and really aligns nicely with Mind the Gap and what we look at is this idea of like de-risking the sector and the space, and your approach around de-risking innovations to make it as easy as possible to create systems change in a sector where that is incredibly difficult due to resource constraints and all of the things that we've spoken about. I think is an incredibly valuable part of the model that GCC puts out there, and then that you all share with and continue to work on. So I'm really glad we're able to dive into that a little bit today and talk about the importance of that. And I'm hoping that other folks who listen in as well can be a little bit inspired by the approach and the work that you all take. And then I think, Nicole, your kind of final comment there, and I wrote it down, was, mental health fits everywhere and it fits nowhere. I've never thought about it that way, but that's entirely right. It's akin to nutrition and sanitation. It's a force multiplier, right? It improves everything: education, employment, child, health outcomes, you name it. And yet it's still siloed, underfunded, and often seen as optional. So if anyone takes anything from today, hopefully it's quite clear that it's not an optional area to fund. It's just a part and parcel of everything that we do. So all in all, thank you so much for a great conversation, a great discussion, and for answering all of our questions. It's been a pleasure, and really appreciate you helping us think more expansively about what it means to fund mental health. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you both so much. It's wonderful to have the opportunity like this. We're usually so deep in the weeds of things, to be able to kind of step back and talk about a lot of these bigger picture issues that the innovators we're working with, that we ourselves are kind of grappling with, is always both so interesting and also a lot of fun. So I really appreciate it. It's like diving into these topics. It's so important, and it's as you saw from Sahil, like a lot of passion there as well from our side. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Me too. I think thank you so much for inviting us. Thank you so much for this opportunity to discuss. And thank you so much for the summary. I really liked the summary. Chris and Christy, you have done really well summarizing things. Maybe you give the summary in writing so that we can have it with us. Well, thank you so much. I loved discussing all of these points, all of these questions. It was amazing. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Thank you both.
All the best. Thank you very much.